les pronoms objets, partie B, indirect object pronouns. Bonjour les élèves. So we're going to take a look at the second part of our object pronoun notes. This is where it starts to get a little confusing, so make sure you take really good notes. You may want to go back and look at what we talked about in part A before you take a look at this video. But let me just remind you that object pronouns are the person or thing in a sentence that receives the action. There are two types of object pronouns. There are indirect objects, who are typically people that do not directly receive the action of a sentence. And there are direct objects, which could be people or things that do directly receive the action of a sentence. So take a look at this sentence that has an indirect object in it. Il téléphone à son père. Son père, his father, is the indirect object. He is indirectly receiving a phone call. Look at the second sentence here. J'écris à Marc. Marc is the indirect object. He is indirectly receiving something that's been written. Le prof parle aux élèves. Aux élèves is the indirect object. The teacher is talking to the students. Now compare those sentences to these sentences that have direct objects. Il aide son père. Son père is a direct object. J'écris une lettre. Une lettre is a direct object. It is directly being written on. Le prof donne les devoirs. Les devoirs is a direct object. Now, if you compare the sentences on the left to the sentences on the right, you'll notice one important factor in the sentences that have indirect objects is the word à, the word to, or in the last sentence, au, which, if you'll remember, is actually a contraction between à and les. So look at this sentence here that has both a direct and an indirect object. J'écris une lettre à mon ami. I'm writing a letter to my friend. Okay, let's take a look at the three nouns that we see in this sentence. The first noun is je. That arrow should probably be over to the left a little. And that is the subject of our sentence, the person who is doing the action. Then we have une lettre. Une lettre is the direct object in this sentence. It is directly being written on. Then we have mon ami, which is the indirect object. It is indirectly receiving that writing. Something is being written to my friend. So that by definition, an indirect object tells to whom or for whom the action is performed. The book likes to put it in this way: the person who benefits from the action. But I like to think of it as to whom the action is being done, because that little word à, or a contraction of à, will be in sentences that have an indirect object. So let's take a look at the pronouns that would replace those indirect objects, the words that would follow à. If it's first or second person, you're going to use these, me, te, nous, or vous, which probably look familiar because me, te, nous, and vous can also be direct object pronouns. They can also replace nouns that are directly receiving the action of the sentence. But when they are indirect object pronouns, they're translated slightly differently. As indirect object pronouns, me means to me, te means to you, nous means to us, and vous means to you all. Notice again the word to is in that translation for each of those. Now if you're talking about third person, you're going to use the words lui or leur. Lui means to him or to her. There's not a difference for masculine or feminine. It's both lui. You probably remember this from our vocab list and the expression offre-lui or tu pourrais lui offrir. We saw that when we were going over our vocabulaire en. And leur can be translated as to them. So it's important to note that lui and leur replace a person or people that follow the word à. So if you're going to use lui, lui is going to replace the word à and the singular person that follows it. Leur is going to replace the word à and the people that follow it. Now remember, that could be a contraction. It could be o or o-a-u-x as well. So look at this sentence. Marc téléphone à Marie. In this sentence, Marie is the indirect object. Mark is making a phone call to Marie. Now, if we wanted to use a pronoun and say Mark is making a phone call to her, instead of using her name, we would take a and Marie out, and because Marie is one person, we would replace that with Louis. Louis, because it is an object pronoun, goes in front of the verb. So our new sentence with the pronoun instead of the actual name would be Marc lui téléphone. Mark makes a phone call to her. So something I want to make sure that you understand about indirect object pronouns is that they follow the same word order as direct object pronouns. So when we talked about how when you use le, la, or les to replace a direct object, that le, la, or les goes before the verb, the same thing happens with our indirect object pronouns. So je lui écris, I am writing to him, or I am writing to her. Louis could be either a male or a female. That word Louis, our indirect object pronoun, must go in front of the verb because all object pronouns go in front of the verb in French sentences, not like English sentences. At this point in time, I usually like to give formulas to students because some people like to have just a formula in order to know what words go in what order. And so you may or may not want to put these in your notes, but if you have a simple sentence like je lui écris, this is the word order you're going to follow. You'll start with your subject, person doing the action. You'll have your object pronoun, whether it's a direct object pronoun or an indirect object pronoun, and then you'll have your verb, and then you might have something else in the sentence. That's the same word order that the sentence je t'aime or I love you follows. Now, if you wanted to make that simple sentence negative and add ne and pas is going to go around the pronoun and the verb. So you would start with your subject, then you would use ne, your object pronoun, verb, pas, and then anything else in the sentence. So if you were to take that example, je lui écris, and make it negative, it would be je ne lui écris pas. I am not writing to him, or I am not writing to her. The most complicated is when you have two verbs in a sentence. You'll start with your subject, then you'll conjugate that first verb, whether you're saying I'm going to write, I want to write, I like to write. That first verb will be conjugated. Then the object pronoun will go in front of the infinitive of the verb. Because remember, the object pronoun goes in front of the verb that it receives the action of. So if you were going to take the sentence je lui écris and say I'm going to write to him, it would be je vais, because that's the conjugated verb, lui, and then écrire, the infinitive of écrit. Also, to add, just an FYI for you, if you wanted to make that sentence negative, just a little bit more complicated, ne and pas will go around the conjugated verb. So to make the sentence, I'm going to write to him, a negative sentence, it would be je ne vais pas lui écrire. Very, very complicated. It takes a lot of practice to get used to that. Okay, so there are some verbs that typically take indirect object pronouns. I just wanted to show you this list, and these are typically verbs that show giving, receiving, or communicating with someone. Notice in this list, all of these words have a after them. Some of these verbs could take both a direct and an indirect object pronoun, but those, let me go back. Those are some of the verbs that you'll see that will typically have a person receiving the action here as an indirect object. You make a phone call to someone, you answer to someone, you write to someone, you give something to someone, you send something to someone. Offrir is also, remember, to give, and then dire, to say, you say something to someone. So these are verbs that try to remember will typically have an indirect object with them. So you'll use indirect object pronouns oftentimes in front of these verbs. Okay, so I have just two sentences that I want to have you try in your notes, and we'll go over these in class. But if you take this sentence, je vais téléphoner à mes amis, go ahead and write that in your notes. Figure out what would be the indirect object of this sentence. Then replace that indirect object with a pronoun and rewrite this sentence so that instead of saying I'm going to make a call to my friends, you're saying I'm going to make a call to them. The second sentence, try this one. Je parle au prof. Instead of saying I am talking to the teacher, I want you to try I am talking to him.